They called it a worthless fake. It had my grandmother's real will hidden inside. I want to start with that sentence, because for nearly 6 years I believed a single careless claim made by my own aunt about a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, a claim that cost me considerably more than I ever imagined a small tarnished locket could possibly be worth. I want to tell you exactly how I discovered the truth, and exactly what that discovery eventually revealed, because I think, if you've ever had something precious taken from you, under a confident, dismissive claim you had no reason at the time to question, you already understand the particular, quiet unraveling that happens once you finally learn you were right to trust your own instincts all along. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the objects our loved ones leave behind, and the specific, undeniable truths those objects sometimes carry, long after everyone assumed there was nothing left to discover. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Grace. I am 32 years old, and 6 years ago, my aunt told me that a locket my grandmother had given me shortly before her death was a cheap, worthless costume piece, a claim I believed entirely, without question, until an entirely unrelated visit to a jewelry recently revealed that this same locket contained a hidden compartment holding my grandmother's own handwritten note, along with a small folded key that would eventually unlock considerably more than either of us could have anticipated. I want to tell you about my grandmother first, because I think understanding our specific relationship matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. My grandmother Josephine was, throughout my entire childhood, the single most stabilizing presence in an otherwise complicated family. My parents divorced when I was 6, and in the years that followed, while my mother worked long hours rebuilding our family's financial stability, I spent countless afternoons and entire summers at my grandmother's modest but genuinely warm house, a place that felt, throughout my childhood, considerably more like home than either of my parents' increasingly strained, transitional apartments. I remember specific details of that house with unusual clarity even now: the particular smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings, the specific creak of the third porch step, the small garden she maintained along the side fence where she taught me to identify different vegetables by their leaves alone, long before they'd fully matured into anything recognizable. I remember her patience with me during those difficult years, never once making me feel like a burden during a period when both of my parents were, understandably but painfully, consumed by their own separate struggles. And I remember, specifically, how she always made a point of asking me detailed questions about my own inner life, my worries, my small childhood triumphs, in a way that made me feel genuinely, consistently seen, in a period when I often felt overlooked amid my parents' larger, more visible adult crisis. I want to describe my grandmother's specific character because I think it matters for understanding exactly why the locket she eventually gave me carried such profound emotional significance, well beyond whatever its actual material value might have been. Josephine had grown up during genuinely difficult economic circumstances. The daughter of immigrant parents who arrived in this country with almost nothing, building a modest but stable life through decades of careful, disciplined work. She carried throughout her entire adult life a particular philosophy about material possessions that she repeated to me often during my childhood visits. The idea that true value rarely correlates with a price tag, that the most meaningful objects in a person's life are usually the ones carrying story and memory rather than significant monetary worth. I want to tell you about the specific locket itself, because understanding its actual history matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. The locket had belonged to my grandmother's own mother, my great-grandmother, a woman who had passed away decades before I was ever born, someone I knew only through my grandmother's stories and a handful of faded black-and-white photographs. My grandmother told me, on numerous occasions throughout my childhood, that this locket represented one of the only physical objects her own mother had managed to bring with her during the difficult journey to this country. A small, tarnished, unassuming piece of jewelry that had somehow survived decades of genuine hardship and displacement. I remember the specific afternoon, when I was around 10 years old, when my grandmother first showed me the locket properly, opening a small wooden box she kept on her dresser, carefully unwrapping the piece from a soft cloth, and placing it gently in my open palm. I remember its weight, considerably heavier than its modest size might have suggested, and its specific, slightly oxidized surface that spoke of genuine age rather than any careless neglect. My grandmother told me, that afternoon, that this locket would someday belong to me, a promise she repeated, with quiet consistency, throughout the following years of my childhood and early adulthood. I remember specifically the way she handled the locket that afternoon, a particular reverence and care in her movements that struck even my 10-year-old self as somehow different from how she handled other objects around her house, however cherished. She told me that day, a version of her mother's immigration story I had heard in fragments before but never with quite this level of specific detail, describing the exact ship her mother had traveled on, the specific few possessions she'd managed to bring, and how this particular locket had been sewn carefully into the lining of a coat for the entire journey, hidden from view specifically to protect it from theft during a passage that, by all accounts, had been genuinely dangerous and uncertain. I remember asking her, that day, why the locket mattered so much if it wasn't, as far as I understood at the time, particularly valuable in any conventional sense, and she told me, with a specific quiet firmness I still remember clearly, some things carry a value that has nothing to do with what anyone else decides to price them at, Grace. Remember that. I want to tell you about my grandmother's final illness, because it represents the specific period during which she formally, deliberately gave me this locket, along with the exact words she used when she did. My grandmother was diagnosed with congestive heart failure approximately 7 years ago, a diagnosis that, given her advanced age and the specific nature of her condition, offered a relatively limited but genuinely meaningful window of time before her eventual passing. I spent considerable time with her during those final months, driving to her house several times weekly, sitting with her through long afternoons of conversation, listening to stories about her own life that she seemed increasingly determined to share fully before she no longer had the opportunity to do so. Approximately 3 weeks before she passed, during one of these quiet afternoon visits, my grandmother asked me to retrieve the small wooden box from her dresser, and she formally, deliberately placed the locket in my hands, along with a specific set of instructions I want to describe to you carefully, because I have replayed her exact words countless times in the years since. I remember that specific afternoon vividly, the late autumn light coming through her bedroom window at a particular slanting angle, her voice considerably weaker than it had been even a few weeks earlier, but her eyes, when she looked at me while placing the locket in my hands, carrying an intensity and clarity that felt, in that moment, entirely undiminished by her declining physical condition. I remember her hands, papery and cool against mine, holding onto my fingers for a long moment after the locket itself had already transferred into my possession, as though she were trying to communicate something through that physical connection that words alone couldn't fully convey. She told me, holding my hands in her own increasingly frail ones, that this locket carried more meaning than its modest appearance might suggest, and that I should keep it somewhere genuinely safe, understanding, even in that moment, some part of me registered the particular weight and specificity of her instruction as carrying more significance than simple grandmotherly sentiment. She told me specifically, "Grace, this holds more of our family's actual story than anyone else in this family currently understands. Promise me you'll keep it safe, and that you won't let anyone convince you it isn't worth protecting." I want to be honest that, at the time, I understood this instruction primarily as emotional guidance, an elderly woman's natural desire to ensure her most treasured possession would be properly cherished after her passing, rather than any literal practical warning about the locket's actual contents. I promised her, sincerely, that I would keep it safe, and I want you to remember that promise, because it becomes considerably more significant later in this story than either of us likely understood in that specific moment. My grandmother passed away 3 weeks later, peacefully, at home, with several family members present, myself included. I want to tell you about the period immediately following her death, because it represents when the actual conflict regarding this locket first began, a conflict I didn't fully understand the true stakes of until many years later. My grandmother's estate was relatively modest, primarily consisting of her small house, some modest savings, and various personal belongings accumulated over her long life. My aunt, Diane, my mother's older sister, took primary responsibility for managing the estate's settlement, given her closer geographic proximity to my grandmother's house during those final years, and her generally more assertive, take-charge personality within our extended family. Approximately 2 weeks after the funeral, during a family gathering specifically organized to begin sorting through my grandmother's personal belongings, my aunt noticed the locket, which I had been wearing, and asked with what struck me at the time as simply practical, organizational curiosity, whether I would be willing to have it formally appraised alongside the rest of my grandmother's jewelry collection, explaining that a proper appraisal would help ensure fair distribution of the estate's various sentimental items among the extended family. I remember that specific gathering taking place in my grandmother's own living room, still filled with her furniture and belongings, an atmosphere of careful, subdued grief, mixed with the practical necessity of the estate sorting work everyone had gathered to accomplish. I remember my aunt's specific tone when she first mentioned the locket, warm and reasonable, entirely consistent with the collaborative, fair-minded approach she seemed to be taking toward the broader distribution process. Nothing in her manner suggesting anything beyond genuine, practical estate management concern. I want to be honest that I agreed to this request without significant hesitation, understanding it, at the time, as a reasonable practical step in the broader estate settlement process, rather than any deliberate attempt to separate me from something my grandmother had specifically, deliberately entrusted to me alone. I want to tell you about what happened over the following several weeks, because this period represents the actual beginning of a pattern I would not fully understand until many years later. My aunt took the locket, along with several other pieces of my grandmother's jewelry, to what she described as a professional appraiser, returning approximately 3 weeks later with a formal appraisal document. This document characterized the locket as a mass-produced costume piece from the mid-20th century, constructed primarily of base metal rather than any precious material, assigning it a nominal value of approximately $35, a fraction of the value assigned to several other pieces in my grandmother's modest jewelry collection. I want to describe my reaction to this appraisal, because I think understanding my genuine, unquestioning acceptance of this information at the time matters enormously for understanding exactly how significant the later discovery eventually became. I remember my aunt presenting this appraisal document to me directly, at her own kitchen table, sliding it across toward me with a specific, matter-of-fact confidence that discouraged any particular scrutiny, the kind of confident presentation that, I understand now, made questioning its accuracy feel almost socially awkward, as though doing so might imply some kind of distrust toward a family member who had, after all, taken the time and initiative to arrange this appraisal on everyone's behalf. I remember scanning the document briefly, noting its official-looking letterhead and formal language, and feeling no particular reason, at the time, to request any additional verification or second opinion. I remember feeling a specific quiet disappointment upon learning this appraisal, not because the locket's monetary value particularly mattered to me. My grandmother's specific instructions about keeping it safe had never been framed around financial worth, but because some part of me had, without fully articulating it even to myself, believed the locket carried some deeper, more substantial significance than a simple $35 costume piece would typically suggest. My aunt, presenting this appraisal to the broader family during our subsequent estate distribution meeting, suggested that given the locket's minimal actual value, it made sense for me to simply keep the piece itself, as it carried primarily sentimental rather than financial significance, while several other, more valuable pieces of jewelry, ones the appraisal had assigned considerably higher monetary worth, would be distributed among other family members as part of the broader estate settlement. I want to be honest that I agreed to this arrangement without any significant objection, understanding it, at the time, as a genuinely reasonable, fair approach to distributing my grandmother's various belongings, and feeling, if anything, a certain relief that I would retain possession of the specific piece my grandmother had personally entrusted to me, regardless of its modest appraised value. I want to tell you about the following 6 years, because during this period, I simply continued believing the appraisal's characterization entirely, wearing the locket occasionally on specific meaningful occasions, but never with any particular concern for its physical security, given my understanding that it carried minimal actual monetary value. I remember, specifically, wearing the locket to my own wedding 3 years after my grandmother's passing, a small private choice that felt meaningful precisely because I believed, at the time, that its significance was purely sentimental, rather than financial, understanding it, in my own mind, as a piece I wore specifically because it represented pure, uncomplicated connection to my grandmother's memory, rather than any material value worth protecting. I remember, too, occasionally leaving it carelessly in various jewelry boxes during moves between apartments, or lending it briefly to a close friend for a costume party, decisions I now look back on with a specific, quiet unease, understanding how easily this object, carrying considerably more significance than any of us realized, could have been permanently lost or damaged during those years of casual, unconcerned handling. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led to the locket's true nature finally being revealed, because this discovery emerged, almost entirely by accident, during a period when I had no particular reason to be investigating the piece's history or authenticity at all. Approximately 4 months ago, I decided to have several pieces of my own jewelry professionally cleaned and inspected, a routine maintenance step recommended by a friend who had recently experienced a similar service with genuinely positive results. I brought several pieces to a well-regarded local jeweler, including somewhat as an afterthought given my long-standing assumption that it carried minimal value, my grandmother's locket. I want to describe the specific moment when the jeweler, a careful, experienced craftsman named Mr. Aldrich who had operated his own small shop for over 30 years, first examined the locket closely because this moment represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. Mr. Aldrich examined the locket under his jeweler's loupe for a considerably longer period than he had spent on any of my other pieces, his expression shifting gradually from routine professional attention to something closer to genuine focused curiosity. He asked me eventually where I had acquired this particular piece, and when I explained its family history, he told me carefully that several specific characteristics of the locket's construction struck him as inconsistent with the mid-20th century costume jewelry category my family's previous appraisal had assigned it. I remember standing at his counter, watching him turn the locket slowly under his bright work lamp, occasionally making small, quiet sounds of consideration as he examined its clasp mechanism, its specific engraving pattern, the particular way its edges had been finished. Details I wouldn't have known to notice myself, but that clearly carried genuine diagnostic significance for someone with his decades of specialized experience. He mentioned specifically that the clasp mechanism in particular reminded him of a specific handcrafting technique common in certain European jewelry workshops from an era considerably earlier than the mid-20th century the original appraisal had assigned it. A detail that, he explained, alone wouldn't be definitive, but that combined with several other characteristics seemed worth investigating further. I want to describe my reaction to this comment because it represents the first genuine crack in an assumption I had carried, entirely unquestioned, for 6 full years. I told Mr. Aldrich, somewhat reflexively, that the piece had already been professionally appraised years earlier, characterized specifically as a mass-produced costume item of minimal value. He nodded thoughtfully, but told me, with the careful, measured honesty of someone who took his professional reputation seriously, that he would recommend a more thorough examination, given several specific details he'd noticed that seemed, in his considerable professional experience, worth investigating further, before accepting the previous appraisal's conclusions without question. I want to tell you about the specific examination process that followed, because the details Mr. Aldrich eventually uncovered fundamentally transformed my understanding of everything that had happened 6 years earlier. Mr. Aldrich requested several additional days to conduct a more thorough examination, using specialized equipment beyond what his shop typically employed for routine cleaning services. I remember leaving the locket with him that day feeling a strange, unfamiliar anxiety about being separated from it, even briefly, an anxiety I hadn't experienced during any of my previous 6 years of casual, unconcerned handling, as though some part of me had already begun sensing the piece's genuine significance even before any formal confirmation arrived. When I returned, he explained with visible, genuine excitement beneath his careful professional demeanor exactly what his more thorough examination had revealed. He walked me through his findings methodically, showing me photographs he'd taken under various types of specialized lighting, pointing out specific metallurgical markers that confirmed genuine silver content rather than the base metal alloy typical of mass-produced costume pieces, explaining each technical detail patiently, understanding, I think, that I needed the full, careful explanation to genuinely absorb how significantly this contradicted everything I'd believed for 6 years. The locket, he explained, was not, in fact, mass-produced costume jewelry at all. Its construction, upon careful metallurgical analysis, indicated genuine handcrafted silver work considerably more valuable than the base metal characterization my family's original appraisal had assigned it. More significantly, Mr. Aldrich explained that he had discovered something during his examination that he described as considerably more unusual and interesting than the piece's actual material composition alone. The locket, it turned out, contained a hidden compartment, cleverly concealed beneath what appeared, to casual inspection, to be simply the locket's decorative back panel. A construction technique Mr. Aldrich explained was occasionally used in antique jewelry specifically designed to secretly hold small, meaningful items, photographs, locks of hair, or, in rarer cases, small folded documents. I want to describe the specific moment Mr. Aldrich opened this hidden compartment in my presence, because it represents, I think, the actual emotional climax of everything I eventually discovered. Inside this small, carefully concealed compartment was a tightly folded piece of paper, aged but remarkably well preserved given its apparent decades of protective concealment, along with a small, ornate key, considerably smaller than a typical house key, the kind commonly used for safety deposit boxes or small personal lock boxes. I remember the specific sound of that hidden panel releasing, a small, precise click that Mr. Aldrich later explained resulted from a tiny, cleverly disguised spring mechanism, something he described as remarkably sophisticated craftsmanship for a piece of this particular era and origin. I remember my own hands trembling slightly as he carefully extracted the folded paper, setting it gently on a clean cloth on his workbench before allowing me to unfold it myself. Understanding, I think, the particular significance this moment likely carried for me personally, regardless of whatever its actual contents might reveal. I want to tell you about the note itself, because reading it, sitting in Mr. Aldrich's small shop, surrounded by the ordinary tools and materials of his careful craft, remains one of the most disorienting experiences of my entire life. The note, written in my grandmother's own distinctive handwriting, was dated approximately 8 years before her death, considerably before her final illness began, indicating that whatever she had written had been carefully, deliberately prepared and concealed years before she formally passed the locket into my possession. I want to share what the note actually said, because I have read it countless times in the months since this discovery, and its specific language carries, I think, considerable significance for understanding my grandmother's actual intentions. I remember reading this first note slowly, my finger tracing over her familiar handwriting, the same distinctive slant and careful loops I recognized from countless birthday cards and letters throughout my childhood. A handwriting that felt, in this specific context, almost like hearing her voice directly again after years of only having memory to rely on. She wrote, "To whoever eventually finds this note, if you are reading these words, it likely means the locket has finally reached the hands of the person I always intended it for. This key opens a safety deposit box at First Heritage Bank, box number 447, registered under my full legal name. Inside you will find documents regarding a piece of property I purchased privately, many years ago, kept separate from my other estate matters specifically because I wanted to ensure it eventually reached the right person, rather than becoming entangled in whatever family disputes might arise regarding my more visible, obvious assets. I trust whoever holds this locket to handle what they find with the same care I have always tried to hold for our entire family, even the parts of it that have not always made that care easy to offer. I want to tell you about my immediate reaction upon reading this note because I think it matters for understanding exactly how disorienting this discovery genuinely was. I sat in Mr. Aldrich's small shop for a considerable period, reading and rereading this note, understanding, slowly, that my grandmother had apparently prepared this specific concealment years before her death, with a deliberate, careful intention that had nothing to do with simple sentimental jewelry and everything to do with some additional, previously unknown asset she had specifically wanted to reach a particular, deliberately chosen person. I want to describe the following several days, because they required me to navigate a specific, urgent question I hadn't anticipated needing to address. Exactly how to proceed with this discovery, given everything my family had believed, for 6 years, about this locket's actual nature and significance. I contacted an attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Patricia Vance, who specialized in estate matters, explaining the full situation and requesting guidance regarding how to properly legally access whatever this safety deposit box actually contained, given the considerable time that had passed since my grandmother's original passing and the formal closure of her estate years earlier. I want to tell you about what we eventually discovered inside that safety deposit box because the contents proved considerably more significant than even the note itself had suggested. Working with Patricia, and providing the bank with appropriate documentation establishing my identity and my grandmother's original account registration, along with the physical key itself, we eventually gained access to box number 447 at First Heritage Bank, a box that had remained entirely untouched, its existence apparently unknown to anyone else in our family, for the considerable years since my grandmother's original deposit. I remember the specific afternoon Patricia and I visited that bank together, a considerably more formal, sterile environment than Mr. Aldrich's warm, cluttered jewelry shop, a bank employee leading us through a careful verification process before finally escorting us to the small private room where we would examine the box's contents. I remember my hands shaking again as I inserted the small key into its corresponding lock, understanding, in that specific moment, that I was about to learn something my grandmother had apparently wanted kept secret for years. Protected specifically, until whatever right circumstances she had anticipated finally arrived. Inside, we found a formal property deed, indicating my grandmother had privately purchased a small parcel of undeveloped land approximately 15 years before her death, a property located in a region that had, in the years since her original purchase, experienced considerable development and corresponding increase in property value. The deed itself listed my grandmother as the sole owner, with a specifically prepared, notarized addendum indicating her intention to transfer this property, upon her death, to whichever family member she specifically designated in a separate sealed letter, also contained within the same safety deposit box. I want to describe reading this additional, sealed letter because its contents finally, fully explained everything my grandmother had apparently been quietly, carefully planning years before her actual passing. I remember Patricia handing me this second letter carefully, having already reviewed its contents herself, to confirm its legal relevance before allowing me to read it in full, a small, professional courtesy I appreciated given the emotional weight I sensed, even before opening it, that this particular document likely carried. I remember sitting in Patricia's office, my hands not quite steady as I unfolded this second piece of paper, my grandmother's same distinctive handwriting immediately recognizable, considerably more formal in its language than the brief note hidden within the locket itself, suggesting she had taken particular care in drafting this specific document. She wrote, addressing this specific letter directly to whichever attorney or bank representative eventually helped process this discovery, that she had purchased this property specifically because she had grown concerned, in her final years, about certain patterns she had observed within our broader family, patterns of favoritism and unequal treatment that she worried might eventually disadvantage the specific family member she felt had shown her the most genuine, consistent care and attention throughout her later years, without that same family member necessarily receiving equivalent consideration during the eventual, more visible distribution of her primary estate. She wrote, specifically, I have watched, over many years, how certain members of this family receive attention and consideration simply because they are the loudest, the most assertive, the most persistent in claiming what they believe they deserve. I have also watched one specific person consistently show up, quietly, without demanding recognition, simply because she genuinely cared. I want this property to go to Grace, specifically, and I have deliberately hidden this intention from the rest of the family, understanding that if I had made this decision known during my lifetime, it likely would have created exactly the kind of conflict I have always tried to avoid within our family. I trust that by the time this letter is read, whatever conflict might have arisen will already be settled, and this can simply be my own final, private way of ensuring that genuine care is eventually recognized, even if it takes years longer than it perhaps should have. I want to tell you about the specific, practical implications of this discovery, because the property itself, upon professional appraisal conducted as part of the legal process required to formally transfer ownership, was valued at just over $420,000, a figure that reflected the considerable development and corresponding value increase the surrounding region had experienced in the years since my grandmother's original purchase. I remember the specific afternoon Patricia called to share this appraisal figure with me. Sitting alone in my own living room and feeling a strange, disorienting numbness rather than any immediate excitement. The sheer scale of the figure feeling almost abstract against the considerably more intimate, personal significance the entire discovery had already carried for me emotionally. I remember asking Patricia to repeat the number twice, not because I hadn't heard her clearly, but because some part of me needed the specific, concrete confirmation before I could begin to fully process what this actually meant for my own life going forward. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to learning this specific figure, because I think it matters for understanding the genuinely complicated emotional territory this entire discovery required me to navigate. I did not feel simple, uncomplicated excitement upon learning this property's substantial value. I felt instead something considerably more layered. Genuine grief revisiting itself freshly, understanding that my grandmother had been quietly, carefully planning this specific gift for years, likely thinking of me during private moments I never knew about, alongside a complicated, difficult reckoning with exactly what her letter revealed about her own perception of favoritism and unequal treatment within our broader family, an assessment I had never fully articulated to myself during her lifetime, but that, reading her own words now, resonated with an uncomfortable, specific accuracy. I want to tell you about the conversation I eventually had with my Aunt Diane, because I think understanding her reaction matters enormously for the full resolution of this entire story. I contacted Diane approximately 3 weeks after the safety deposit box discovery. Once Patricia had helped me fully understand the legal implications and had begun the formal process required to transfer the property into my name. I explained as calmly and factually as I could manage exactly what had been discovered: the hidden compartment, my grandmother's original note, the safety deposit box, the property deed, and her sealed letter explaining her specific intentions. I remember making that phone call from my own kitchen, deliberately choosing a private, familiar space rather than any more formal setting. Understanding that whatever her reaction might be, I wanted to receive it somewhere I felt genuinely grounded and secure. I remember the specific quality of silence on her end of the line as I worked through the full explanation, a silence considerably longer than I had anticipated, before she finally spoke. I want to describe Diane's initial reaction, because it surprised me, at first, with its genuine confusion rather than any immediate defensiveness. She asked repeatedly how this was possible, given that the locket had been professionally appraised years earlier as a simple costume piece worth only $35. I asked her, directly, which appraiser she had actually used for that original assessment, a question I want to be honest, I hadn't thought to ask with any real scrutiny 6 years earlier, when I had simply, trustingly accepted whatever documentation she presented at the time. I remember her voice shifting, during that specific portion of our call, from genuine confusion into something considerably more careful and measured, a shift I noted at the time without fully understanding its significance until Patricia's subsequent investigation revealed exactly why that particular question might have prompted such caution. She told me, initially, that she couldn't quite recall the specific appraiser's name, offering to look through her old records, a response that struck me, even in that moment, as somewhat inconsistent with how confidently and specifically she had originally presented that appraisal's findings 6 years earlier. I want to tell you what I eventually learned about this original appraisal, because the details, once I finally investigated them properly, revealed something considerably more troubling than simple appraiser error. Working with Patricia, I traced the original appraisal document back to its source, discovering that the appraiser Diane had used was not, in fact, a formally certified, independent jewelry appraiser, but rather an acquaintance of Diane's husband, someone who ran a small pawn and second-hand shop rather than any credentialed appraisal service, someone who, upon Patricia's further investigation, had no formal certification or training in accurately assessing antique or potentially valuable jewelry pieces. I remember Patricia walking me through her findings during a follow-up meeting at her office, spreading out copies of business registration records and licensing documentation that clearly established this appraiser's actual professional background, considerably different from what the original documentation my aunt had presented 6 years earlier had implied through its formal, official-looking letterhead and language. I remember feeling a specific, slow-building anger during that meeting, not the sharp, immediate anger of a fresh betrayal, but something more complicated, a delayed recognition of exactly how thoroughly I had trusted a document I now understood carried none of the actual professional authority its presentation had originally suggested. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to definitively characterize Diane's actions as deliberate fraud, given that I genuinely cannot know, with full certainty, whether she understood, at the time, that this particular appraiser lacked proper qualifications, or whether she had simply carelessly chosen a convenient, informal option without fully considering the potential consequences of an inaccurate assessment. But I do want to tell you about a specific detail that emerged during my later, more thorough investigation, because it complicates any simple, generous interpretation of Diane's original actions. Patricia's investigation revealed that this same informal appraiser had, in the years since assessing my grandmother's locket, been formally investigated by local authorities for a pattern of significantly undervaluing jewelry pieces brought to him by elderly clients or their family members, a pattern that had allowed him, in several documented cases, to subsequently purchase these undervalued pieces himself at a fraction of their actual worth, before reselling them for considerably more through his own separate business connections. I want to tell you whether Diane had any direct financial relationship with this specific appraiser beyond her husband's personal acquaintance, because I think this detail matters considerably for understanding the full scope of what actually happened. Patricia's investigation did not find definitive evidence that Diane herself profited directly from this appraiser's pattern of undervaluation, though she did confirm that Diane's husband had, in fact, purchased 2 other pieces from my grandmother's original jewelry collection directly from this same appraiser. Several months after the original estate settlement, pieces that had been assigned notably low values in the original appraisal, and that Diane's husband subsequently resold, within the following year, for considerably higher prices through an online antique jewelry marketplace. I remember Patricia walking me through the specific documentation establishing this pattern. Online marketplace listings she had located and archived, showing the exact pieces, their original undervaluation, and their subsequent resale prices. A paper trail that, while not conclusively proving Diane's own direct knowledge or involvement, certainly established a pattern considerably more troubling than simple, isolated appraiser incompetence. I remember feeling, reviewing these documents together, a specific, quiet sadness beneath the anger, understanding that whatever the full truth of Diane's actual awareness or involvement, this pattern had clearly benefited her own household at the expense of other family members' rightful inheritance from my grandmother's estate. I want to be honest with you about how I feel regarding this specific discovery, because I think it complicates any simple narrative of Diane as either fully innocent or fully deliberate in her actions. I do not know, with complete certainty, whether Diane specifically, knowingly selected an appraiser she understood would undervalue my grandmother's jewelry collection, allowing her own husband to subsequently profit from these undervalued pieces. But I do know that the pattern, once fully investigated, reveals a considerably more troubling picture than simple innocent appraiser error, and I know that Diane's own initial insistence, that I simply keep the worthless locket while more conventionally valuable pieces went to other family members, pieces her own husband would later personally acquire and profit from, carries a specific, uncomfortable weight in light of everything eventually uncovered. I want to tell you about the conversation where I presented this fuller picture to Diane directly, because I think it represents the actual closest thing to resolution this particular story has offered. I met with Diane along with Patricia present to help navigate the legal and factual details, approximately 2 months after the initial discovery. I laid out, calmly and without significant emotional accusation, exactly what Patricia's investigation had revealed. The appraiser's lack of formal credentials, his documented pattern of undervaluation, and her own husband's subsequent purchases and resales of pieces from my grandmother's original collection. I remember that meeting taking place in Patricia's office conference room, a deliberately neutral setting neither of us had any particular emotional history with. I remember Diane's posture throughout much of the conversation, arms crossed tightly, her usual assertive confidence replaced by something considerably more guarded and uncertain, occasionally glancing toward Patricia as though hoping for some legal technicality that might complicate or contradict what I was calmly, methodically presenting. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this entire experience had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. Diane's response, "I want to be honest," remained somewhat evasive throughout much of our conversation, insisting that she had genuinely believed, at the time, that the appraiser she'd chosen was reputable, and expressing what struck me as genuine, if perhaps incomplete, surprise regarding her own husband's subsequent purchases and resales. She did not offer during that specific conversation any full, unambiguous acknowledgement of deliberate wrongdoing, and I want to be honest with you that I have made a specific, deliberate choice not to pursue this matter further, through any formal legal action, understanding, after careful consideration with Patricia, that establishing definitive, provable intent regarding the original appraisal would likely require resources and emotional energy I ultimately decided weren't worth expending, particularly given that the property itself, my grandmother's actual, primary intended gift, had already been successfully, legally secured in my name. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several months removed from that initial discovery in Mr. Aldrich's small jewelry shop. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through a hidden compartment and a substantial property discovery. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, renewed grief for my grandmother that arrived freshly, unexpectedly, alongside genuine gratitude for her careful, deliberate foresight, and a complicated, ongoing reckoning with exactly what her own words revealed about the family dynamics she had quietly observed and worried about throughout her final years. I visited the property itself for the first time approximately 6 weeks after the discovery, driving out to the specific parcel of land on a quiet weekend morning, standing alone in what was, at the time, simply an undeveloped, overgrown field, trying to imagine what my grandmother might have envisioned when she originally, privately purchased this specific piece of land so many years earlier. I remember standing there for a long time, understanding that I was looking at physical evidence of years of careful, quiet planning I had known absolutely nothing about while she was still alive, and feeling, in that specific moment, a particular kind of grief considerably sharper than what I'd experienced even at her original funeral, the fresh, renewed loss of realizing exactly how much thoughtful, deliberate care she had continued extending toward me from beyond her own lifetime. I have kept the property she left me, choosing not to sell it despite its substantial value, understanding, instead, that I want to eventually build something meaningful there myself, something that honors the specific, careful intention behind her gift rather than simply converting it into an immediate financial windfall. I have begun working with an architect on some very early concepts, nothing finalized yet, but I find myself drawn, increasingly, toward the idea of building something there that could someday serve a purpose beyond my own personal use, perhaps a small community space or garden that reflects my grandmother's own quiet, generous spirit, a way of ensuring that whatever she ultimately intended this gift to represent continues extending outward, rather than remaining simply a private, personal windfall. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Trust, once extended, deserves periodic verification, even from people we love and generally believe act in good faith. I trusted my aunt's presentation of that original appraisal entirely, without question, for 6 full years, and I think there is a meaningful lesson in understanding that healthy trust and reasonable verification are not actually opposites, particularly when significant value, whether financial or sentimental, is genuinely at stake. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since this discovery. The people who love us most quietly, without demanding recognition, sometimes carry a clearer understanding of family dynamics than we ourselves fully recognize while we're still living inside them. My grandmother observed something about our family's patterns of favoritism that I had never fully articulated to myself, and her careful, deliberate planning reflected an understanding of our family's actual dynamics considerably more clear-eyed than I think any of us, myself included, would have credited her with at the time. Here is a third truth. Objects carrying genuine sentimental value deserve careful, qualified assessment before their significance is definitively dismissed. I nearly lost, entirely, the actual truth this locket contained, simply because I trusted an informal, unqualified appraisal without ever thinking to seek a second, more credentialed opinion. A decision I now understand, with the clarity of everything eventually uncovered, deserved considerably more scrutiny than I originally gave it. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require aggressive confrontation to feel genuinely complete. I did not pursue formal legal action against my aunt, despite having reasonable grounds to at least investigate the possibility further. I chose instead to focus my energy on honoring what my grandmother had actually, deliberately intended, understanding that this focus mattered considerably more to me than pursuing whatever additional accountability a more aggressive legal approach might have eventually secured. Here is a fifth truth, one that took me the longest to fully accept. Grief does not end simply because sufficient time has passed since a loss. I believed, before this discovery, that I had genuinely, fully processed my grandmother's death years earlier. This experience taught me that grief can resurface, freshly and powerfully, whenever new understanding of a loved one's final wishes and quiet sacrifices comes fully into view, and that this resurfacing, however unexpected, is not a sign of unresolved grief done wrong, but simply evidence of love that continues finding new dimensions to mourn and appreciate, even years after the initial loss. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who love us most carefully prepare their final gifts years in advance, understanding with remarkable foresight exactly what obstacles those gifts might eventually need to overcome before finally reaching the person they were always intended for. My grandmother hid her true intentions inside an ordinary, unassuming piece of jewelry, trusting that patience, careful preparation, and the eventual arrival of the right circumstances would someday allow her genuine wishes to finally, fully be understood, however many years that understanding ultimately required. That is my story. 6 years of believing a careless, unqualified claim, 1 routine visit to a careful jeweler, and 1 hidden compartment that finally revealed exactly how much my grandmother had quietly, deliberately planned to protect what she believed genuinely mattered most. I still wear the locket regularly now, though considerably more carefully than I did during those 6 unknowing years, understanding, finally, the full weight of what it actually represents. I think about my grandmother often when I wear it, not simply as the warm, patient presence of my childhood, but as a woman who continued, quietly and deliberately, protecting and providing for the people she loved most, years after anyone would have reasonably expected her active care to end. I think that is perhaps the truest legacy she could have left me, not simply the property itself, valuable as it genuinely is, but the specific, enduring example of exactly what patient, thoughtful love can accomplish, even when it must wait years to finally be fully understood. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the objects and gifts our loved ones leave behind sometimes carry more significance than we initially recognize, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time something you nearly dismissed turned out to carry far more meaning and value than you originally understood. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.